The drought came in July of 1981, and it didn't leave until October. By the time it was done, the topsoil in Calhoun County, Illinois had cracked into plates the size of dinner tables, and the corn on most farms had gone to nothing. Not bad. Nothing. Stalks that topped out at 4 feet. Ears that filled halfway, if that. The county extension office put the average yield at 67 bushels per acre. That was the lowest number recorded in Calhoun County since 1954. Everett Goss stood at the edge of his north field on a Tuesday morning in late September and counted the rows still standing. He was 44 years old. Had been farming 143 acres in the bottomland east of Hardin since 1963. The corn in front of him was short, sparse. He'd known since August it would. He'd walked every row by hand in the third week of July when the sky had gone white with heat and stayed that way. He'd made notes in a small brown notebook. The notebook was in his back pocket. He pulled it out. Read the numbers again. Turned a page. Turned back. Then he walked into the field. Not to check damage. He'd already done that. He walked to find the plants that had held on, the ones that had made something from nothing. In a drought year, those plants told you more than any extension bulletin could. They told you what had survived, what had pulled water from somewhere the others couldn't reach, what had kept filling when everything around it quit. He found 7 of them, in that 7 plants in 143 acres that had pushed ears past 12 inches in a summer that killed everything else. He marked each one with a strip of orange flagging tape. Came back the following week, stripped the ears himself, laid them in the bed of his Ford F-250, and drove them to the barn. His neighbor to the west, Don Klepper, saw him doing it. Said it was a waste of time, said it wouldn't make any difference. Said the seed companies had already done that work 40 times better with equipment Everett would never own. Klepper had been buying Pioneer hybrid seed since 1971. Paid $38.50 per bag that year. Planted it every spring without question. Everett kept loading the ears into the truck. He'd been saving seed since 1968. Not casually. Not out of sentiment. Out of arithmetic. The seed companies charged what they charged, and every year they charged a little more, and every year the contract terms got a little longer, and every year the seed came pre-treated with chemicals Everett didn't recognize from a label he couldn't read without squinting. He'd done the math in 1967. At his scale, seed cost him $1,840 per season. His total gross that year was $14,200. Seed alone was 13 cents of every dollar before he'd bought a drop of fuel or a pound of fertilizer. He started saving seed in the spring of 1968. Started small. 8 rows in the east field. Corn he'd selected himself from the prior year's best-producing plants. He didn't tell anyone. Not his wife, Margaret. Not his father, who still lived 4 miles north. He just planted 8 rows and watched what happened. The yield from those 8 rows in 1968 was 114 bushels per acre. The hybrid from the seed company, planted on the rest of the farm that same year, came in at 1.9. The difference was 5 bushels. Everett wrote it down. Didn't say anything to anyone. Just wrote it down. By 1972, he was saving seed from 40% of his acreage. By 1975, it was 70%. By 1978, he was saving seed from every field he ran. He kept the records in a series of brown notebooks stacked on a shelf above the workbench in the machine shed. 11 notebooks by 1981. Each one labeled by year. Each one containing row numbers, plant heights, ear lengths, grain weights, and yield figures measured to the half. The 1981 drought didn't care about any of that. Heat stress arrived the second week of July, right at pollination. That was the worst possible timing. Corn pollinates over a narrow window of 6 to 10 days. A dry, hot wind during that window can cut yield in half before the plant even shows stress. Everett knew this. Every farmer in Calhoun County knew it. The difference was that Everett's seed had been selected, year by year, from plants that had shown better tolerance to heat and moisture stress on that specific ground. Not because Everett had read about plant genetics. He hadn't. He'd read about it incidentally in a university extension circular that arrived in the mail in 1974 and sat on the kitchen table for 3 weeks before he picked it up. What it said confirmed something he already understood from watching. Plants that survived hard years passed something forward. Not always, not reliably, but enough, often enough to matter. The 7 plants he'd marked in the north field that September were the best of what had survived. He dried the ears in the barn through October and November, hung them on wire in rows, each tagged with a strip of masking tape and a pencil number. When the corn was dry enough to shell, he ran it through the hand sheller he'd bought at a farm auction in 1969 for $4. Poured the kernels into labeled glass jars, 41 jars, sealed and stored on the shelf next to the notebooks. Don Klepper ordered his Pioneer seed that November, paid $41 per bag. Told Everett at the co-op that the new variety was supposed to be drought-tolerant, said the sales rep had shown him a chart. Everett didn't say what he was planting. The spring of 1982 was wet. Too wet in April, which pushed planting into the first week of May. Everett had his seed staged in the barn by March 15th. He'd sorted the jars twice more over the winter, pulling out any kernels that had gone soft or discolored. Final planting stock, 30. He'd tested germination on a sample of 200 kernels in late February, using a damp cloth and a warm corner of the kitchen. Germination rate, 91%. The Pioneer seed rep had told Klepper to expect 94% from the new hybrid. That 3% difference amounted to about 3 plants per 1,000. Everett had calculated it. It didn't worry him. He planted 143 acres the first week of May 1982. Took 4 days. He ran a 2-row planter behind the farmall he'd rebuilt in the winter of 1979. The planting population was 28,000 seeds per acre on the flat ground, 24,000 on the knolls where moisture ran off. Those numbers weren't from a seed company recommendation. They came from 11 years of Everett's own records, cross-referenced against rainfall maps he'd gotten from the county soil conservation office. Nobody in Calhoun County planted that way. The seed company recommendation that year was a flat 32,000 seeds per acre, regardless of terrain. June 1982 was close to ideal. Temperatures in the high 70s. Rain twice a week in 2-inch increments. The corn came up. By the 3rd week of June. Everett's north field was knee-high and dark green in a way that made him stop the tractor and look at it for a long moment before continuing. He'd seen that color before in good years. He hadn't expected it so early. He wrote in the notebook, June 21. North field. Color very good. Population even. No skips visible from the fence. Klepper drove by that, slowed down at the fence line. Kept going. July was warm, but not brutal. August brought 3 weeks without rain, which in a normal year would have put stress on the corn. The plants on Everett's ground responded differently than they had in 1981. They didn't shut down. The leaves rolled slightly in the afternoon heat, the way corn will when it's conserving moisture, but they unrolled by morning. The ears kept filling. Everett walked every field the 3rd week of August, pulled back husks on 30 ears across each field, measured the kernel rows with a cloth tape measure he kept in his shirt pocket, wrote the numbers down. The results weren't what he'd expected. They were better. Average ear length on the north field, 9.4 inches. Average kernel rose, 16 point. Grain fill visible to the tip on 27 of the 30 ears he'd sampled. In a dry August, on ground that had barely recovered from the 1981 drought, those numbers didn't match anything in his notebooks for the prior 4 years. He checked them again the following week. The numbers held. Harvest came the third week. Everett ran his 1966 John Deere 95 combine across the north field on a Monday morning when the temperature was 38 degrees and the air smelled of frost and dry corn husks. The combine was 16 years old. He'd replaced the cylinder bars in the spring and shimmed the concaves twice. It ran without complaint. He weighed each load on the scale at the grain elevator in Hardin. Wrote down every ticket. The north field took 2.5 days to harvest. When the last load came in and he totaled the tickets on the tailgate of the truck, he added the column 3 times before he believed it. Northfield yield, 162 bushels per acre. He stood there in the elevator lot with the tickets in his hand and the smell of diesel and grain dust in the air, and said nothing for a while. The county average that year, as reported by the Extension Office in November, was 98 bushels per acre. The drought recovery had helped. But 98 was the average. Klepper's place came in at 103, which Klepper talked about at the co-op for 2 weeks. Everett's west field came in at 158. The east field, which had a clay subsoil problem along the south edge that had plagued him since 1971, came in at 141 on the good ground and 119 on the clay. He averaged all 3 fields together. His farm-wide average, 154 bushels per acre, 56 bushels per acre above the county average. He drove home and wrote the number. Then he sat at the kitchen table and did the calculation he'd been doing in his head since October. At that year's corn price of $2.68 per bushel, 56 extra bushels per acre across 143 acres was $21,428 in additional revenue. His seed cost for the year, $0 in purchased seed, plus approximately $140 in labor, storage, and testing. His neighbor's average seed cost, $41 per bag, roughly $2,050 for a comparable acreage. The difference wasn't subtle. It wasn't close. It was $23,000 in combined savings and additional revenue on a farm that grossed $59,000 in a good year. Margaret looked at the numbers when he showed her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if he'd told anyone. He hadn't. He wasn't sure he was going to. Word travels differently in farm country than it does in other places. It doesn't spread fast. It spreads slow and specific, through fence-line conversations and elevator talk and borrowed equipment that comes back with questions attached. By the following March, 3 farmers had come to Everett's machine shed to ask about his yield numbers. Not because he'd told them. Because the elevator manager, a man named Carl Brower who'd been weighing grain in Hardin since 1958, had compared loads, had noticed the ticket weights, had mentioned it to someone at the fuel co-op. Everett showed the 3 men his notebooks, all 11 years, laid them on the workbench and let the men read. They stood there for 40 minutes in a shed that smelled of oil and old corn and cold concrete, and read the records the way men read something they don't quite believe but can't find a way to argue with. One of them, a younger farmer named Bobby Stout, who'd been renting ground east of Hardin for 4 years, asked if Everett would sell him seed. Everett thought about it, said he might have some to spare, said he'd look at what he had going into the '83 season and see. He had plenty. He'd saved more than he needed, deliberately, for 3 years running. Sold Stout 14 bushels of seed corn in February of 1983. Charged him $9 per bushel. That was $126 total. Pioneer's price that spring was $44.50 per bag. Stott planted it on 40 acres of his rented ground and said nothing to his landlord about where it came from. Stott's 40 acres came in at 148 bushels per acre in 1983. His landlord, a retired farmer named Walter Helms, who still drove out to look at the fields every August, walked the rows in early September and asked what seed he'd planted. Stott told him. Helms drove to Everett's place the following week. He didn't call ahead, just pulled into the yard in his '77 Buick and knocked on the machine shed door. He was 71 years old, had farmed 280 acres in Calhoun County for 38 years before his son took over, and he retired to. He told Everett what he'd seen in Stott's field. Said it reminded him of what his own ground had looked like in the early 1950s, before the hybrid seed companies had consolidated the market and made buying your own seeds something to be embarrassed about. Everett showed Helms the notebooks. Helms read for a long time. Didn't say much. When he left, he shook Everett's hand at the door and held it for a moment before letting go. The word spread slower than it should have and faster than Everett expected. By the spring of 1984, 7 farmers had bought seed from him. He charged between $8.50 and $10 per bushel, depending on variety and year of selection. He'd developed 3 distinct lines by then, each one selected from different fields under different soil and moisture conditions. He labeled them by field of origin, North Line, East Line, and what he called the bottom line, selected from the low ground along the creek that flooded every 3rd year and killed whatever wasn't built for wet feet. The seed companies heard about it. Eventually, not Everett specifically, but the pattern. There were farmers across the Midwest doing similar work, and the industry had been monitoring the trend. In the spring of 1985, a representative from DeKalb Genetics drove out to Calhoun County and asked around at the co-op. He found his way to Everett's place on a Wednesday afternoon in April, while Everett was greasing the planter bearings in the shed. The man was 35 years old, wore clean boots and a canvas jacket with the DeKalb logo on the chest. He introduced himself as a regional agronomist, said he'd heard Everett had developed some productive open-pollinated lines, and that DeKalb was interested in genetics conversations, said the company sometimes partnered with farmers who had done interesting selection work. Everett kept greasing the bearings. The man talked for 9 minutes. He mentioned royalty structures and licensing frameworks and multi-year trials. He left a folder of information on the workbench when he went. Everett looked at it after supper. Read it through twice. The company wanted access to his selection data and planting stock in exchange for what the folder described as a mutually beneficial arrangement. The arrangement involved signing an agreement that granted DeKalb a license to evaluate and potentially commercialize any seed line Everett had developed on his property. He put the folder on the shelf next to the notebooks. Left it there. He never called the number on the folder. He kept planting. The summer of 1986 was the hardest since 1981. A late frost in May set the corn back 2 weeks. Then, heat arrived early, in the first week of July, and stayed. Pollination stress again. The county extension office put out an advisory in late July warning farmers to expect significant yield reduction. The Pioneer rep who serviced the area told his customers to prepare for 70 to 80 bushels per acre on good ground. He said the new drought-tolerant hybrid he'd sold that spring had not performed the way the company had projected. Klepper's ground came in at 77 bushels per acre that fall. He'd paid $47.50 per bag for seed that spring. He wasn't in a talking mood at the elevator. Everett's North Field came in at 129 bushels per acre. The difference was 52 bushels per acre. Across 143 acres in the worst growing season in 5 years, his farm outproduced his neighbor by 7,436 bushels of corn. At that year's price of $1.50 per bushel, that was $11,154 in additional revenue before accounting for the $2,050 his neighbor had spent on purchased seed. Carl Brower at the elevator didn't say anything when Everett's loads came in, just wrote the weights on the tickets. but Everett noticed him looking at the numbers for a moment longer than necessary before printing them. By 1987, 14 farmers in Calhoun County were buying seed from Everett. He'd added 2 more lines by then, bringing his total to 5. He'd also started charging a flat $11 per bushel across all varieties, partly because the labor of maintaining 5 separate selection programs had gotten significant. He'd recruited Margaret to help with the record-keeping She kept the secondary log, tracking which farmers were planting which lines and what results they reported back at the end of each season. The reported results came back in every November, written on index cards or note paper, or sometimes just called in by phone. Everett logged them in a new set of notebooks he started in 1984, green ones this time to distinguish them from the original brown selection records. By 1987, the green notebooks contained yield data from 22 different fields across 6 farms in Calhoun County. The aggregate data was not subtle. On fields planted with Everett's seed, the 5-year average yield from 1983 to 1987 was 143 bushels per acre. The county 5-year average for the same period, as reported by the Extension Office, was 104 bushels per acre. The difference was 39 bushels per acre, sustained over 5 years across a variety of soil types and weather conditions. Don Klepper stopped by the machine shed in November of 1987. Said he'd been talking to Stott. Said he was wondering about the seed. Said he supposed Everett might have some to spare. Everett said he might. Klepper planted Everett's north line on 80 of his acres in 1988. Paid $11 per bushel for it. Didn't tell the Pioneer rep when the man came by in March. The Pioneer rep had been servicing Klepper's account since 1971. He drove away without a sale for the first time in 17 years. Klepper's 80 acres of north line came in at 137 bushels per acre in 1988. The remaining acreage he'd planted with Pioneer came in at 108. He called Everett in October, the day after he finished harvest. Said he wanted to talk about. Everett said to come by any time. The seed operation had grown beyond what Everett had imagined when he'd first filled 41 glass jars in the fall of 1981. By 1990, he was selling seed to 23 farms across Calhoun County and 3 farms in Pike County to the south. He'd built a proper seed drying and storage room onto the east side of the machine shed in the winter of 1988. Cost $4,400 in materials. He'd done the construction himself over 6 weekends, with Stout helping on 3 of them. The storage room held 800 bushels of cleaned and sorted planting stock across 5 lines. Temperature and humidity were managed by a small electric unit he'd bought used from a seed company that had gone out of business in Springfield. The unit had cost him $320. It kept the room at 40 degrees and 40% relative humidity through the winter, which was close enough to ideal that his germination rates never fell below 88%. He sold 340 bushels of seed in the spring of 1990. At $11 per bushel, the seed operation grossed $3,740. Not a fortune. But it was money from something that had started as arithmetic on a kitchen table in 1967, had grown through 22 years of walking fields and writing in notebooks, and had survived 2 droughts, a representative from DeKalb Genetics, and more conversations at the co-op than Everett could count. The County Extension Office published a report in 1991 analyzing yield trends in Calhoun County over the prior decade. The report identified a cluster of farms in the eastern part of the county that had consistently outperformed county averages by 30 to 40 bushels per acre. The report attributed this to several factors, including improved drainage infrastructure and favorable microclimate conditions in the bottomland areas east of Hardin. It didn't mention the seed. Everett read the report at the kitchen table one evening in December, set it down, picked it up again, read the drainage infrastructure section. He set it down again, didn't say anything about it. The selection work. By 1993, the North Line had been refined through 25 years of continuous selection. Each generation had been chosen from the top 7% of plants on moisture-stressed years and the top 12% on normal years. The logic was simple. A plant that excelled in a bad year contained something a plant that only excelled in a good year did not. Stress selection was. Everett hadn't learned it from a book. He'd understood it from watching the 1981 drought reveal which plants had something the others lacked. He tried to explain this once to the county extension agent, a man named Dennis Carver, who'd taken the position in 1989. Carver was 31 years old and had a degree from the University of Illinois. He listened carefully, asked several questions, took notes, said it was interesting from a theoretical standpoint, but that the research on open-pollinated corn versus modern hybrids was fairly conclusive. Said the yield gap between open-pollinated varieties and commercial hybrids had been documented extensively. Everett nodded, said he'd read some of that research. Carver drove out to look at the North Field in August of 1990, stood at the fence line and looked for a while. Said nothing about what he saw. Drove away. He came back the following spring. Said he'd been thinking about what Everett had said. Said he was curious about the selection methodology. Said the county office might be interested in documenting it. Everett showed him the notebooks, all of them, the brown ones from 1968 to 1983, the green ones from 1984 to 1993. 26 notebooks on the shelf above the workbench. Carver sat on a stool in the machine shed and read for 2 hours. He came back 3 more times that year. In the fall of 1994, the Extension Office organized a field day at Everett's farm. 17 farmers came. They walked the fields in October after harvest, and Everett stood at the fence line and answered questions in a voice that didn't carry much and didn't need to. The yields were posted on a board Carver had made from plywood and painted white. Everett's farm-wide average that year was 159 bushels per acre. The county average was 100. One of the farmers who came to the field day was a young man named Travis Heim from the northwest part of the county. He was 27 years old and had been farming his family's ground for 3 years since his father had gotten sick. He didn't say much at the field day. Stood toward the back of the group. Asked one question. What year had Everett started? Everett said 19. Heim drove home that afternoon and ordered a copy of every extension circular on open-pollinated corn selection he could find through the university library system. He planted Everett's bottom line on 60 acres the following spring, bought the seed at $11 per bushel, kept his own records from that first year. Everett farmed his ground in Calhoun County until when he was 64 years old and the arthritis in his right hand had gotten to where he couldn't run the combine without stopping every hour to let the grip rest. He sold the machinery and rented the ground to Stott, who'd expanded to 340 acres by then and was running 3 of Everett's 5 lines across all of it. The sale of the equipment took 4 months, and an auction that drew buyers from 3 counties. The notebooks stayed in the machine shed on the shelf above the workbench. Everett kept the seed storage room operational through 2004, running the humidity unit and maintaining the planting stock for the farmers who still bought from him. 17 farms were still buying in his last year of selling. He stopped in 2004, not because demand had dropped, but because the selection work required walking the fields in August. And walking the fields in August required a right hand that could hold a tape measure. Stout had learned the selection methodology by then. So had Heim. Between them, they carried the 5 lines forward without Everett's direct involvement, maintaining their own records and their own notebooks, making their own selection decisions each fall. The County Extension Office published a second yield analysis in 2003, covering the prior 20 years. The cluster of high-performing farms in the eastern bottomland had continued to outperform the county average. The gap had widened slightly to 42 bushels per acre, above average. This time the report noted, in one paragraph near the end, that several of the farms in the cluster had maintained open pollinated seed programs of multi-decade duration. It was one paragraph. No names. Everett's notebooks are still in the machine shed. Bobby Stott owns the property now. He added a second storage room in 2009 when the volume of seed he was maintaining outgrew what Everett had built. He kept the original room intact. The electric humidity unit Everett bought used in 1988 is still running on the east wall, still holding the room at 40 degrees through winter. Stott checked it last November. Still working. Travis Heim has been maintaining his own selection records for 31 years. His notebooks are on a shelf in his own machine shed, 14 miles northwest of where Everett started. He's on his third set of them. Green covers, like Everett's. The North Line is still being planted in Calhoun County. Different hands. Same ground. Still outgrowing what the companies sell. Still just selection and patience and a notebook.